Bookseller Crow.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Bookseller Crow. Well done for coming up the hill through the snow and the various ways and that you got here. But we're really excited to welcome back Kerry and Zoe, who were here last time in 2018 for their debut novels. And it's a really wonderful thing that you've come back together 4 years later, sorry, not 3 years later. So we're really delighted to say hello. So if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together, just welcoming you here. You're coming as well. So yes, Kerry and Zoe were here. Zoe was here talking about her first novel, Folk, and Kerry was here talking about Swan Song 4 years ago. And so this year, they're back with their latest novels, Mischief Acts and Skin, which I have just read and are absolutely amazing. If you haven't read them, I've been in tears, I've been biting my nails, I've been whipped around, let's just say, the world in time. So Zoe Gilbert, I should just do a quick introduction of both authors, and then they're going to have an in conversation with each other because you're sort of your old pals of sorts. And then we're going to have a couple of questions of Q&A. So please do think of some questions, but we'll keep that bit quite brief. So Zoe Gilbert is author of the collection of confected myths in her debut, Folk, and has made Herne the hero of her second book. The Guardian says of Mischief Acts that she's weaving together prose and poetry, myth and history, the past, present and future. It's a work of extraordinary ambition and brilliantly realised. And I would agree. Writer and musician Kerry Andrew, second novel Skin, is an atmospheric creation, following young Matty, an introverted kid from North London whose father, I'm giving it all away now, disappears one day. It's a tale of identity and queer waves, I'd call it. The Guardian wrote, Skin stirs with references to water myths, from selkies and mermaids to sirens and cursed bodies of water. The overall register is one of soft loneliness, and I would happen to agree. So, welcome. I'm going to sit on the bench, and I'm going to get the ball rolling with a question of, I was wondering if you would both do a reading at some point, but thought maybe you could introduce your books a little bit and say perhaps where the genesis, if you can remember that far back to the genesis of where these tales began. So if you want to start, Zoe, then I'll take the back seat.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So Mischief Acts is set in the Great North Wood, and the remainders of that wood are still here, all dotted around Crystal Palace and Sydenham and beyond. And I was living on the edge of Sydenham Hillwood, on the Sydenham Hill estate, when I started writing about the woods. Anyone who knows it will know that it has its own little atmospheres, and there are lots of stories about it anyway. People who've lived in there, things like the ghost train bricked into the tunnel, all the fun ones. But there's so much more, and I started digging around into what that wood used to be like, huge, full of activity, and what had happened to it over the years. And that was what got me going, really, combined with the idea of, what it would be like to actually live in there. And because I suppose the way people connect to landscapes and nature, well, certainly for me this is true, it's inevitable that folklore is involved in that in some way. We personify our natural spaces, or we find symbols and meanings in them that are often linked to folklore. And so when I started looking at our kind of classic folkloric denizens of the woods and the forests, Herne the Hunter was bound to come up. And he just became my sort of totem, or my spirit of the place that I wanted to represent the wood and its troubled history, even though he's become tied to Windsor and the great oak at Windsor, thanks to Shakespeare. But just blame him. It doesn't have to be. So I slightly nicked him from Berkshire and put him here. But I think I can get away with it because I think he's in all woods, and he's like the mischief maker associated with Puck and Robin Goodfellow and Robin Hood and those kinds of characters. So anywhere there's a wood, there'll be mischief. There's definitely mischief in Sydenham and Dulwich woods, as you will know if you ever go there. Maybe you're creating it. So that was another thread I really wanted to pull on. You know, how do we use woods, and what do we approve of and disapprove of, and why, and is that okay? So I suppose that was the genesis of something that became a bit of a sprawling beast. But it just started with those woods.
And this is my book Skin. It's about a little kid called Matty, and in the first part of the book, it's in two main halves. The first part of the book, Matty is 11, and it wasn't a spoiler to say that Matty's dad goes missing, because that's the very first sentence, so you didn't give anything away. So Joe, who's Matty's dad, just doesn't come home from work one day, and there's no real explanation for this, and Matty has quite an imaginative inner world, and the last place that Joe was seen was Hampstead Men's Pond. Matty and Matty's mum Rosa didn't know that he even went there, so that's already a bit mysterious. But Matty is drawn sort of detective-like to the world of the ponds, the men's ponds and the other ponds in Hampstead, and drawn to not just the heath but the water, and starts swimming in that water as well. And in the second part of the book, Matty is an adult aged 25 and is still looking for answers as to Joe's disappearance, but in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, and travelling around in a camper van doing a lot of swimming, because Matty has become pretty obsessed with wild swimming, and the search kind of continues. And the genesis for this, well, it really was my love of swimming outside, and my love of folklore, but chiefly swimming outside. I really remember that I was with my husband Andy, who's in the orange parka at the back, and we were walking to the mixed pond in Hampstead in, I don't know, 2015 or 14 or something. I said, I think I want to write about swimming, because then I can just swim a lot and, you know, research and swim. And that's what I'm always thinking about, is just where can I go and research that's fun. That's basically my reason for writing. And it was just seemed cool to use the ponds, which are, for me, they're the wildest water in London, and just such a magical place. I don't know the men's pond, but I have a men's pond spy in my husband, and do know the mixed and the ladies. My first novel, Swan Song, very explicitly worked with a folk ballad, and was a sort of contemporary exploration of a Irish and then British folk ballad. And I work as a musician a lot with folk song and folk stories as well, and I still wanted to use that world a little bit, but I decided that for this one, you know, I've done it once, I thought I would just explore a lot of watery mythology, and so I just did a lot of reading, mostly kind of British and Irish mythology, but elsewhere in the world too, and just had a lot of notes and research and bits of stories. And then I just kind of left, I suppose as I was researching that, ideas for the narrative for this book kind of came from reading different things. So there's no sort of explicit setting of anything, but it sort of dips in and out. I suppose most transparently, there's a bit of a Selkie story in there. That's a sort of seal spirit from originating from Orkney folklore. But there are lots of other things too. And as a musician, I was also working with the theme of water a lot, so the two things were kind of going side by side. And I found that after I'd written at least the first draft, that somehow, you know, songs that I was starting to learn and sing and arrange had found their way into the book without me even realising, you know, sort of unconsciously, other things sort of rose up from the narrative. But so yeah, my love of swimming and my love of folklore, which is definitely something we can talk about. In fact, I am going to ask you that, Zoe. Can I just ask you first of all, because both of your books are so immersed in folklore, and I think that's definitely where the Venn diagram of us two is why that appeals to you, and where that's come from in your life.
It's a good question, and I think it comes from being attracted to symbolic, metaphorical expressions of deep human experience and emotion and universal experiences or very individual experiences that, I don't know, my favourite kinds of things to read, not necessarily folkloric things or folk tales, but any kind of writing that is telling you one story here and asking you to find the other one underneath, but also letting you interpret and find your own meanings in it, are my favourite kind of things. I don't really like being told what exactly is going on psychologically and emotionally with characters, and I really like being tortured by not being sure exactly. And so that kind of symbolism, I suppose even magic realism, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez style, I love that because it tortures you with not being sure whether you've understood what this shower of frogs means and whether it means anything at all. And of course that's what folk tales are like, and that's what folklore is like, that there's plenty of meaning in there for you to respond to should you wish to, or it can, but I also like it aesthetically, I suppose. And so that sort of looking for connections between how we pass the world, how we understand our own experience, and what exists in our collective mythology is interesting to me, and also why we can assume that tons of folklore has been lost, and some of it persists and it changes and it develops and it becomes something new, and new folklore sprouts, on the internet, Slenderman and creepypastas and all these things, and they're there for a reason. They're these kind of mushroom sprouts from our collective subconscious, I think. And so anything that seems to be grabbing the imaginations of people around me, like other writers that I'm teaching or talking to, or other writers who are writing, or just me, I think it intrigues me, and I think there's something in it. And there's also an extra interesting challenge in trying to express something that matters deeply to you, symbolically or metaphorically. And I also work with writers who cut all that out and write directly, personal experience, which is braver maybe, and that might be what I'm scared of as a writer. But I feel like the extra symbolic layer fascinates me, and so I think that's why. But there's also that extra element that I definitely felt when I was reading your books, which is that there is a connection between folklore and landscape and nature, without romanticising nature, or turning it into a resource, neither of which I'm into. But it leads you to look at the landscape and think about it and learn about it or experience it differently, and it definitely enriches my experience of the world, and I guess that's why it keeps coming back.
Yeah, and that's definitely the thing that appeals to me, I think, most is folklore's connection to nature, and I feel like that's something that for many of us in many parts of the world has been lost, that sort of sense of, I don't believe in fairies or sprites or anything else at all, but I believe in the use of stories to enchant the natural world and to make it I think it's just how we love it the most, and I feel like that's something interesting that's perhaps been lost by a lot of people, but yeah, I still think about
it. And that sort of one of the things that I've thought about when I was thinking about both of your books together was that these are extraordinarily real feeling people in Kerry's novels, having real dilemmas and terrible normal human things happening to them, but the folkloric thread and especially in relation to the natural landscapes that they find themselves in, whether it's against their will or not, is really important. And that sort of, it really made me think about how you don't need to believe in fairies to be interested in folklore, but it doesn't take away the seriousness of the rational world for you to also entertain the what ifs. What if this is happening because someone did meet a Selkie? Not that this happens, but what if these things are real, and that we can have that overlay of magical thinking on top of our experience of the normal world, and it doesn't do us any harm, and it might do us some good. And your characters are not superstitious in any sort of obvious traditional way, which I really love. They're not sort of thinking, "Ooh, is this happening because I'm going through a magical transformation," or anything so obvious, which is a much bolder use of folklore to my mind. but the theme comes through so clearly, and it's almost as though, because they are rational actors, the folklore in your novels is embedded in the landscape sort of inexorably, and they're kind of exposed to it. It's doing something to them without them sort of making that explicit, and that feels analogous sometimes to our experience of the world when we do get those feelings of things not being quite just ordinary.
That's really interesting. It's not something I sort of consciously thought about. I love it when other people talk about your work and make you seem more clever than you actually. But I think you do that a lot in your. I'm thinking of Mischief Acts especially. Maybe in both of your books, that you have this sense of the real world and the whatever it is, the supernatural world or the magical world. Just crossing very subtly, I suppose. I mean, you're not interested in, I can't really think of anything in your books where you're just writing a folk tale or a magical tale or anything like that. That's kind of...
No, probably not. But then maybe I do tend to shy away from contemporary worlds. I mean, I had to force myself through the 20th century in this one.
I wondered.
which was hard, and actually, that's why I think it's quite bold and brave to start as you do. I was going to ask you about this. Do you start with characters and stories and situations, or do you start with the folklore? Or is it a bit more subtle than that? And you said a little bit about it, but it would be interesting to have you elaborate on that.
I think it's a bit of everything. I think it's all just sort of starts growing and simmering. I mean, it really was, swimming, yeah, let's write about swimming. And then Hampstead Heath, and then, how can I make a story? Well, let's read all this stuff. And just things just kind of, grow fairly organically, I think. I mean, I do love thinking about characters and developing characters quite early on. But then they grow as well, because you start writing your story and what you thought they might do or feel doesn't quite fit anymore, and they start changing and growing. First of all, I want to ask about, I suppose Herne is your emblem and your character that is changing and growing throughout your book. I just want to say that I was so excited when I read the blurb, when I was sent the blurb for your book, because I think one of my ways into folklore was watching the 1980s ITV show Robin of Sherwood, which is showing that I am almost 44. And that's why I know Herne the Hunter, is because he was really, at least to my tiny eyes, he was a really mystical and exciting kind of character. Nothing, to be honest, like your Hernes is much cooler and much more interesting and exciting. I have to say that just sort of personally, I was just like, Herne, because of Robin of Sherwood. Where did you come across Herne first? And how did you develop him? And how did he find his way through your different time periods?
I think, like you, he was in there already from all those. He gets cameo little pop-up parts in so many other stories. There's Susan Cooper stories. He's in the Box of Delight, and I still keep coming across them, books and novels and TV shows that have a little Herne pop up at some point. So I clearly already knew. But I think he infuriated me, really. I think that's why I had to because he seemed to be quite macho in a way, but also he had too many roles. He had to be a psychopomp and lead souls off to the other world, but he also had to be this mischief maker. He had to be leader of the wild hunt. He was sort of this forest god, so many things. But because he was performing all those roles, it seemed as though he was never fully separate from dozens, or it turned out to be hundreds of other figures in folklore. And honestly, just the Wikipedia page, it's mind-boggling how many other folkloric figures he connects to. And so I thought, right, I can untangle this. Oh no, of course I couldn't. but it always came back to him. And because he's the kind of one of the most British, even English emanations of this kind of psychopomp, sexy beast, troublemaker character, and there are others, but he's not so impish. He takes himself a little bit too seriously, and so I thought I can have a bit of fun with that. And because I was writing about a very English wood, I kind of revolved around him, but wanted to bring in all of these counterparts that pop up, and that are sort of represent him or extensions of his role in other places. So Harlequin as kind of part of the theatrical world, who is most famous in Italy but went all across Europe, is a sort of version of Herne, and then going back through history sort of connects with Odin and, as I mentioned, Puck and Robin Goodfellow and all these different characters. And it was useful, if a little bit overwhelming, because one of the things I learnt by reading the actual history of this wood, as opposed to any mythical versions, was just that the sheer diversity of life that has passed through it and does pass through it even now, that I had no hope of representing with real people, because I just wouldn't be skilled enough to. So I could use all these different archetypes from myth and make Herne sort of multiple and ever-changing, as a way of representing as well that's what has happened to the wood. That sometimes it's been useful, sometimes it's been for work purposes, it's been for shelter, it's been for war, then it's not been useful, or it's just been for leisure, and it's been many, many things, and it still is and will be, presumably. So if I had any reason to stick with Herne, maybe those are some of them. But I think that sort of the mischief part, that's what it kept coming back to. And he seemed pretty naughty to me, and quite sort of, he does a lot of harm, and as a mythical character, he damages the forest. He's not afraid to do awful things to people, and he's, in the various stories about how he becomes Herne, horrible things are done to him as well. And I'm very interested in that tension between mischief and freedom, and how do you find what you want and who you are, and not feel confined, and harm, which is the risk is that you do harm if you let yourself go wild. Not in all cases, but it's almost necessary to the idea of just really letting rip and going crazy, that you have to risk harm to other people, and he embodies that.
May I ask, if it's not clear, Zoe's Mischief Acts, which is amazing, is it spans many centuries and has many different voices, and it's so it's stylistically just total wizard. It's just amazing. But how did you choose those particular time periods? And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask about the sort of very last parts of the book, or if that's too spoilery, but am I allowed to say that? It sort of goes into it starts however many centuries ago and goes past now and into the future a little bit too. I'm just really interested in how you selected those particular time periods to write about.
Sometimes because something real was happening. So the Crystal Palace burning down is in there, so that had to be in the year that the Crystal Palace burns down. And then other things like the year that Christmas was sort of cancelled by the Puritans, and which led to actual riots and skullduggery, and so I set a story around this. So I kind of researching it's local history combined with national history, I suppose, led me to particular dates, and then it does go into the future, I think about 2070, so not too far, and I'm terrified of writing about the future and anything that feels scientific or sort of risky, and it's more comforting to go backwards. So that was terrifying, but I thought if I don't go too far, I don't have to predict too much. And I very much hope that what happens in the book doesn't happen in reality. It's not disaster, but it would be quite annoying. But yeah, it was just far enough for us to believe that things might have changed. And in terms of the climate change that's driving that bit of the book, hopefully in not too heavy-handed a way. That's already happening anyway. So I probably could have just set it in 2025. And, yeah.
Could I ask you both whether you'd be could read a section?
We're supposed to do that, aren't we?
Oh yes.
Shall
You
I
go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll just read a little bit from quite close to the beginning of the book. So, Matty has gotten into the men's pond by pretending that the chap in front is his dad, and is in the men's pond for the second time, just sort of kind of looking for and just thinking about Dad Joe and whether he was in there, and meeting a new friend. It was earlier in the day than last time and not busy. The sun was hot when the clouds weren't over it. An old man with a droopy Wild West moustache was doing breaststroke very slowly, and a couple of younger men were diving, their stomachs sucked in as their arms stretched up. Two swimmers hugged close to the rope markers, doing front crawl, their mouths opening and closing like goldfish. Matty swam slowly to the middle of the pond, heading for the floating platform. Tried to imagine Dad in here, tired after work, having had a pint or two in the pub first and maybe gone a bit thin Lizzy, like he sometimes said. No one was on the platform today. He'd be easily missed here in the water on the far side of it. The lifeguards hardly seemed to watch half the time, chatting to each other, caps pulled down low. Matty turned over and floated face up, arms out flat and eyes closed, the sun beating down. Lungs like inflatables. Breathe in and you rose. Out and you sank just a little, like Dad might have done. Time to stop breathing. Arms sagged. Legs. A line of cool liquid rose slowly into each ear. The water rocked a queasy sway, and Matty's body was lulled 180 degrees round, face in the pond, drowning. It would be like dreaming. Suddenly a hand was dragging Matty back round and yanking a fist's worth of t-shirt. Cough, snot, cough. Matty fumbled, holding onto someone's bare shoulders, kicking, blinking madly. Two dark eyes right there. What in the bleeding hell do you think you're doing, dickhead? There was a loud whistle blown from the lifeguards area. Matty stopped kicking, partly held by the boy, and gazed back, heart full of water, lungs full of air. Are you dead? No. The boy prodded Matty in the chest. Ow! Up! His face was very close. Still coughing, Matty had clambered up onto the central platform and now sat exhausted, as if having just run the London Marathon. The boy from the water was peering fiercely about 2 inches away. Slick dark hair, his eyes so bog brown that they were almost black. He sat back on his haunches, running a palm over his hair and waggling the water off. Droplets had caught the light. His shape seemed liquid, his skin lined in sun. Balancing on his heels, the boy clasped his hands in front of him and let out a breath. A really annoyed breath. Seriously, you're a dickhead. There seemed to be nothing to say. You couldn't thank someone who had rescued you from drowning when you had been half trying to drown. Shivers started coming, a head rush. Matty jumped back in and swam very fast toward the walkway. Short, shallow breaths. Where are you going? The boy's voice was flung into the air. But he didn't follow.
I'll go ahead.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask Kerry a question about that. I'll read a little bit from the beginning of chapter 1, which is kind of how Herne becomes Herne, really. We might not get that far. As in a dream, he woke. He told us this. It was as if he dreamed. A kind of fever, it seemed, a terror, or a chill delight, to watch as we did the great white stag, silver in that magic hour, the hour before night. To watch it leap, almost fly, a great horned angel, a demon becoming, the dreadful churn of hooves as it charged our king. Why was our king not on horseback? He had slipped down to rest, to cool his heated thighs. He had seen our man before the rest of us, and wished to greet him. Dicky, the kind king, friend to all, had seen our man, his favourite hunter, prized most of all Herne the head hunter, whose absence that day had put us in gleeful mood. For Dicky might have eyes for us, with Herne left at home. He might see us, nimble, swift, ruthless, full of grace in the hunt, without the shadow of Herne casting us all into the dark. He was not such a fine hunter, but fine in Dicky's eyes, and Dicky king. A king is sacred. Perhaps the stag knew this. Horned angel, then demon, a silver charge across that leafy space, brown and gold in sideways dropping sun that made us squint, made us see, but not see. Dicky raise a great powerful arm in greeting to Herne, who was suddenly upon us, having snuck out to the wood. In greeting to the stag, which was suddenly upon him, having leapt from the wood. We saw, but did not see, Herne's leap. Like a dark stag, a shadow stag, betwixt king and crown of antlers. A crown not meant for our kind king, meant for Herne. An act of brave self-sacrifice. An act he would be most beloved, not just as hunter, but as saviour, cunning martyr. As if we all dreamt it, standing with our eyes wide open, Herne took the blow. A sickening tear of cloth and flesh, leather hanging loose and inward, the stag rearing, turning, a miracle of strength rebuked, and soon only a trail of silver, like smoke gone through the trees. Did Herne cry out when he fell? We heard, and did not hear, for it was Dicky's shout that rang out. Beloved Herne! All our stomachs turned at the one torn and spilling now on the ground at the king's feet. I'll stop there. So I wanted to ask you about Matty's friend becomes quite important, who you heard about in that segment, and is always at the ponds, but we never see them anywhere else. And it was one of the... I'm not going to say too much about Matty's friend, but it made me think about that, the relationship between just fundamentally indoors and outdoors, but more significantly, I suppose, town, suburb, home, city, and nature, even if it's as much nature as is on Hampstead Heath. But in both of your books, you take your characters to very wild places, whether it's up in Scotland or around the lakes in Ireland. And in Swan Song, your protagonist is very much out of her comfort zone up there. And Matty, obviously, is kind of the opposite. But I thought, how do you feel about that dichotomy or that tension? And do you think consciously about how you place your characters in nature, or how they feel about it, or does it just come with the territory, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it just sort of comes with the whatever's sort of going on in the book, or the main aims of the book. And certainly with Swan Song, Polly is a sort of urbane young woman who's just like, oh, what am I supposed to do out here in the West Highlands of Scotland? But the idea with that protagonist is that her relationship with nature changes over the book. Certainly because she comes into contact with particular people who help her understand her environment in a different way. So that was that. I had that quite clearly in my head, I think, when I was at the beginning of writing Swan Song. And in Skin, I think it was, again, happened more organically, but it was about this North London kid in the suburbs in Golders Green, discovering water, and it not being a sort of really conscious, wow, nature, yay, but very much about, where's my dad? My dad, was last seen here. Did he drown? Did something else happen? And then, oh wow, water's nice. And something else leading Matty there. And then I was again really interested in the relationship between my protagonist Matty and nature and landscape and wildness and water, specifically in wild water. Again, throughout the book, because water in the first part of the book, I don't think I said, but it's set in 1985, the first part, and the second part 1999. In the first part of the book, Hampstead Heath and the ponds is a different sort of home. You said home because home with Rosa is is freaked out about Joe having disappeared and can't deal with it and doesn't communicate well and is quite a toxic presence. And so whilst it sort of starts out as being where's my dad, it becomes this sort of place of solace and continues to be a place of solace throughout Matty's sort of young growing up and young adult life, especially because Matty is sort of doesn't identify with a gender binary and just like a sort of safer world there, but it's also sort of mixed up in the idea of somehow something to do with Dad, with Joe, sort of being related to water somehow. And then Matty's relationship with water is challenged about 2/3 of the way through the book in quite a very dramatic and challenging incident, which again is sort of influenced by different folklore, you know, nature and water not just being a place of beauty and it's wild swimming wonderful and everything else, but actually, you know, providing representing sometimes danger and a sort of enemy or something to fear. And so I was really interested in just kind of setting up that relationship and then sort of challenging it, I suppose.
We're just going to have a quick Q&A, so if anyone's got any questions, I think we can take 2 or 3. If anyone would like to pop their hand up. Yes?
Do you think your use of Herne the hunter is because Herne the god, the character, can be interpreted so many different ways? Was that the attraction?
Yeah, definitely that he's slippery and has played different roles for different people, and I suppose I've ended up thinking about him in particular ways myself, but the few people I've been able to talk to about Herne in the book have their own ideas about him as well, or think of him as being, especially fulfilling certain archetypes maybe. So yeah, that multiplicity I guess it isn't that unusual for a figure in myth and legend, because people are constantly retelling like classical Greek myths, say, and giving us new angles on characters, but I don't think his role has necessarily been that fixed ever. It's hard to say, isn't it? But yeah, I think the fact that I couldn't make him one thing was appealing, and I do kick him about a bit and make him change gender and change his role and die multiple times. make him suffer a bit, but I think I agree with you basically.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Ray. You asked part of the question I was going to ask, but it was curious you used the phrase liminal, and I was wondering whether you consider yourselves part of this sort of genre that writes under the kind of blanket term of English weird. By your expressions, probably not.
I haven't really heard that as a literary expression. I kind of can think of that in a sort of musical sense, but I don't. I would be happy to be part of it, frankly, if there is such a thing.
Yeah, I think I do. I think I know what you're pointing towards, and I guess, yeah, my answer would be, well, I'd be honoured to be included, but I honestly don't know, and I guess I don't know how many writers write with a genre hat on, like even someone who is aiming explicitly for something that is folk horror, say, or like right in the middle of the many things that we might pile together that constitute the weird. But yes, it's difficult. I think if I felt that I was starting to aim to join a club or a category, I'd worry. But if I found myself in that one, I'd be really happy.
Has anyone else got a question?
Can I do a general one then? It's not
of course.
But you might both have an opinion on it. Do you think social media has had a positive or negative effect on folklore or folklore culture, or what do you call it?
I'm sure that could be answered in so many ways, but my very first thought was Folklore Thursday, which I think has just stopped. Is that right? Folklore Thursday's just stopped,
sort of,
but
yeah.
there's a sort of, you know, I can think of that as a very positive way of just celebrating folklore on a Thursday, as it did. It had a website as well, but I loved seeing those sort of popping up and finding them very refreshing in a feed that can contain so many other not so pleasant things. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that without going really deep. But
yeah, I guess I'd say both, in that, like things like Folklore Thursday and people randomly sharing things will accidentally expose you to other people's folklore and hopefully lead you down a good rabbit hole. But the flip side of that is the reductive nature of social media on all topics, not just folklore. That if you have to condense your Russian Baba Yaga myth into 280 characters, is going to be rubbish. But hopefully people take it in that spirit and go and have a look. And I am genuinely interested and quite thrilled by the way that new folklore and urban legend can spread like wildfire, probably on social media platforms I'll never use, like TikTok and wherever the Slender Man arrived. And I think that's quite cool. And it's like the equivalent of hanging out in the woods and gossiping that we're not doing anymore. So thank goodness it's still happening somewhere. And it's all folklore is so if it's just in books and no one's retelling it in wonky ways and making it even more creepy or silly, then it's dead. And you want to you want people to keep singing songs, but in new versions. You'd hope that people will keep mangling it forever, and the versions of even the versions of like the Herne the Hunter origin myth on the internet, they're no older than like 100 years and they're fictional, but those have become the accepted folklore, and I love that. It takes away this kind of desperate reverence that we might have for the old sources. I think we should play more fast and loose with these things.
I would recommend that on Instagram. I think it's the British Folk Archive. Is if you're interested in the sort of English weird or the British weird, is really great. And again, it's just, as you say, it's just nice these things kind of just popping out, and some quite fantastically chilling images come up on the British Folk Archive. It's really good.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to say? Rona, just last question, yeah?
I just wanted to make a comment about the wetsuit and the Matty with the wetsuit. I thought that was almost like the shapeshifter of Herne. I just really sort of thought that was brilliant with the putting the wetsuit on and just that whole becoming other. Because it was only at that point, there's certain points I can't explain without giving it away.
Yeah, of course.
Just to say that I kind of went, oh really? That's like biologically, a girl. So it was all kind of. It was only at that moment with the whole wetsuit incident, and also the idea of Herne. It just kind of, both of the books have that brilliant idea of ambiguity and magic, and so just really commend that. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you for speaking so eloquently and beautifully and magically.
They can find you a book for your girlfriend, your husband, your girl or your boy. And if you've got a need for an uplifting read, Justine and Jonathan can pick out a book you'll enjoy. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. What a book, what a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. Crystal Palace Hill, that is. But you can order online.